The night the howling stopped was the night Daniel Mercer realized it had never been a warning. It had been a message. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen treeline somewhere deep in northern Montana, where the wind moved like it had a memory and the silence felt heavier than it should. Daniel had chosen this place because no one else would. 40 years old, a former Army engineer, he carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent too long listening for things that never came, and then too long trying to forget the ones that did. His truck, an old silver Ford with over 200,000 miles, rested beside the porch like a tired companion. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine wood, iron, and the kind of stillness that settled into walls over decades. It had been 6 nights since he arrived, and for 5 of those nights, at exactly 2:17 a.m., Scout had howled. Not barked, not growled, but howled in a low, steady tone that seemed to stretch longer than it should, like it was reaching for something beyond the trees. The first time, Daniel had woken with his pulse racing, hand instinctively searching for something that wasn't there anymore. The second time, he checked the perimeter, boots crunching over frost, breath curling into the dark. By the third night, he stopped reacting and started listening. Scout never moved far when it happened. He would stand near the far wall of the cabin, ears forward, body still, eyes fixed on something Daniel couldn't see. There was no panic in him, no fear, just focus. The kind of focus Daniel remembered from search missions overseas, when silence meant everything. On the 4th night, Daniel stayed awake. He sat at the small wooden table, a notebook open, an old army watch ticking softly on his wrist. When the clock turned 2:17, Scout lifted his head before the sound even began, as if he felt it before he made it. Then came the howl, low and deliberate, vibrating through the floorboards in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten. He wrote it down. Time, duration, direction. The next night, he did the same. And the next. By the 6th night, something had begun to form. Not just a habit, not just instinct. A pattern. The direction Scout faced shifted slightly each night, just a few degrees, always subtle, always precise. Daniel marked it carefully, sketching rough lines across the page, connecting angles, measuring distance from the wall to where Scout stood. It didn't make sense yet, but it didn't feel random either. And then, on the 7th night, 2:17 came and passed. The silence that followed was different. Not empty, not peaceful. It felt interrupted, like a sentence that had been cut short. Scout didn't howl. He didn't even stand. He lay near the door, head low, eyes watching Daniel instead of the wall. Waiting. Daniel felt it then, a quiet shift beneath the stillness, something he couldn't hear, but somehow understood. He looked down at the notebook, at the lines he had drawn over the past 6 nights. Slowly, almost without meaning to, he connected the final marks. The shape that formed wasn't scattered. It wasn't random. It was intentional. A circle. Perfect, centered, not around the cabin, but beneath it. Daniel's breath slowed as he stared at the page, the faint ticking of his watch echoing louder in the quiet room. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a distant whisper. Inside, Scout didn't move. And for the first time since the howling began, Daniel understood something that unsettled him more than the sound ever had. The dog hadn't been reacting to something out there. He had been pointing to something below. Daniel did not move for a long time after he drew the circle. The pencil rested loosely between his fingers, its tip hovering just above the page, as if one more line might change what he was seeing or undo it entirely. But the shape did not shift. It remained steady, quiet, almost patient. Beneath the cabin, not around it, not beyond the trees, directly under the floor where he now stood. The thoughts settled into him slowly, like cold seeping through wood. Scout watched him without blinking, his amber eyes reflecting the dim glow of the lantern on the table. There was no urgency in the dog, no panic, only a kind of expectation, as if he had been waiting for Daniel to reach this exact moment. Daniel closed the notebook and set it aside. The ticking of his watch felt louder now, each second stretching just a little too long. He stood, boots pressing softly against the wooden floorboards, and walked toward the far wall where Scout had stood each night. The boards there looked no different from the rest. Worn pine, faint scratches, the subtle warping that came from years of winter and thaw. But as he stepped closer, something shifted in the air. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, like the space itself held a breath it had not yet released. He knelt slowly, placing his palm flat against the wood. At first, there was nothing. Only the cold surface beneath his glove and the distant whisper of wind outside. Then he waited. 1 second. 2. 10. His breathing slowed, instinct guiding him into stillness the way it once had in places far from here. And then it came. A faint vibration, barely there, like the echo of something deeper than sound. It pulsed once, soft and distant, then faded. Daniel did not pull his hand away. He counted without thinking, the numbers forming in his mind with quiet precision. 27 seconds passed before the second pulse came. The same rhythm, the same subtle tremor. His jaw tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. Patterns like this did not happen by accident. Not in nature. Not in anything built by human hands. Scout stood then, padding quietly across the floor until he was beside Daniel. He lowered his head and placed one paw gently on the exact spot where Daniel's hand rested, as if confirming what he had just felt. The dog's ears tilted forward, his body still, listening to something Daniel could not fully hear yet. The pulse came again. 27 seconds. Exactly. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air of the cabin. He shifted his hand slightly, testing the boards around the spot, pressing down with measured pressure. One plank gave just a little more than the others. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel wrong. He stood and stepped back, eyes scanning the room with a different awareness now. The cabin was older than he first thought. The walls carried layers of repair, small details that spoke of changes made over time. But this section of the floor, it felt untouched. Untouched, or deliberately hidden. He walked to the corner where his pack rested and pulled out a small pry bar, the metal cool against his palm. For a moment, he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of respect for something he could not yet name. The wind outside shifted, brushing softly against the cabin like a distant voice. Scout let out a low breath and sat down, watching. Daniel returned to the spot, knelt again, and slid the edge of the pry bar into the narrow seam between the boards. The wood resisted at first, holding its place like it had for years. Then, with a quiet creak, it gave. The plank lifted just enough to reveal darkness beneath. Not empty space. Not soil. Something deeper. The air that rose from below carried a faint metallic scent, old and still, like a place that had been sealed away from time itself. Daniel paused, listening. The next pulse did not come through the floor. It came from below it. And for the first time since he arrived, the silence inside the cabin no longer felt like peace. It felt like something waiting to be opened. Daniel did not lift the plank any further at first. He crouched there, one hand gripping the edge of the wood, the other holding the pry bar loosely as if the metal itself might disturb whatever lay beneath. The darkness below was not complete. It held a faint suggestion of depth, like a shadow that knew it had been waiting to be seen. The air rising from it carried a coolness that did not belong to the winter outside. It was older, stiller, untouched by the passing of seasons. Scout leaned forward, nose hovering just above the opening, his breathing slow and measured. He did not bark. He did not growl. Instead, he gave a soft exhale, almost like recognition, then stepped back and sat again, leaving the space to Daniel. Another pulse rose from below, subtle but undeniable, traveling through the open gap and into the room. This time Daniel felt it in the air, not just through the floor, a quiet rhythm that seemed to mark time differently from the ticking of his watch. He counted again without meaning to. 27 seconds. Exact. He shifted his grip and carefully lifted the plank higher, exposing a rectangular opening just wide enough to see the outline of something beneath. Not dirt, not stone, metal, smooth in places, worn in others, with a faint seam running along its edge like the top of a sealed door. Daniel set the plank aside and brushed his gloved hand across the surface below. A thin layer of dust came away, revealing a dull gray sheen underneath. There were markings too, faint and almost erased by time, but deliberate. Lines. Numbers, maybe. He leaned closer, angling the lantern so the light spilled into the opening. The beam reached down a few feet before being swallowed, but it was enough to show that the metal surface was not the end. It was only the beginning. A hatch, set into a deeper structure that extended beyond what the light could reveal. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of something aligning. The pattern, the pulses, the exact position beneath the cabin. None of it pointed to chance. He sat back on his heels and looked around the room again, this time not at what was visible, but at what had been hidden in plain sight. The cabin had been built over this. Not near it, not beside it, directly above it, as if someone had intended for it to be found, but only under the right conditions. Scout shifted his weight and stood, walking slowly to the doorway before turning back toward Daniel. His ears flicked once, then settled, as if he was listening to something beyond the walls now. Daniel followed his gaze for a moment, then returned to the opening. The next pulse came, softer this time, but closer, as if the distance between them had narrowed. He reached down and ran his fingers along the edge of the hatch until he found it. A small indentation, barely wide enough for 2 fingers, hidden along the seam. A handle, worn smooth by time. He paused again, his hand resting there, feeling the cold metal against his glove. The silence in the cabin deepened, wrapping around the moment like a held breath. Outside, the wind slowed, brushing gently against the trees. Inside, Scout remained still, watching. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement of something he could not yet explain. Then he tightened his grip and pulled. At first, nothing happened. The hatch held firm, resisting with the quiet strength of something that had not moved in years. Then, slowly it shifted. A soft, low sound echoed upward as the seal broke, not loud, but deep, like a door remembering how to open. The hatch lifted just enough to release a narrow stream of colder air, carrying with it a faint metallic scent and something else. Not a smell, not exactly. More like a presence. Daniel opened his eyes and looked down into the darkness that had just begun to open. And for the first time, he realized that whatever lay below had not only been waiting to be found, it had been waiting for him specifically to find it. The hatch did not open all the way at once. It rose slowly, inch by inch, as if the space below resisted being exposed too quickly. Daniel adjusted his grip, lifting with steady pressure until the metal gave way enough to hold itself open. The darkness beneath shifted, no longer sealed, now breathing faintly into the cabin. He leaned forward, bringing the lantern closer, and the light slipped down into the opening like something cautious. What it revealed was not empty space, but a narrow passage, descending at a slight angle, lined with the same dull metal that formed the hatch. The walls were close, no more than 3 feet apart, just enough for a person to move through if they chose to. The floor below looked solid, though dust had settled unevenly, disturbed only by time itself. Daniel rested the lantern at the edge and listened. The pulse came again, clearer now, traveling upward through the passage with a steady rhythm that felt almost deliberate. 27 seconds. Always the same. Scout moved closer, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor, and stood beside Daniel without looking down. Instead, he watched the space around them, ears shifting toward sounds too faint for human notice. Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out a small flashlight, testing the beam before lowering himself carefully through the opening. His boots found the metal surface below with a muted echo, the sound absorbed quickly by the narrow walls. The air was colder here, still and heavy, carrying that same metallic trace mixed with something older, like a place that had not been touched in decades. He straightened slowly, the ceiling just above his head, forcing him to tilt slightly as he turned. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the passage extending forward into shadow. No wires, no obvious mechanisms, just the faint lines along the walls, etched or worn, forming patterns that did not immediately make sense. He took one step forward. The sound of his movement was quiet, but not silent, and it lingered longer than it should have, as if the space held on to it. Another pulse followed, closer now, not just beneath him but around him, echoing softly along the metal surfaces. Daniel paused, letting the rhythm settle into his awareness. It was not random. It was not natural. It felt measured, intentional. He moved again, slower this time, counting without thinking. The passage angled slightly downward, no more than a few degrees, but enough to suggest depth beyond what he could see. After about 10 feet, the walls widened just enough to ease the pressure of the space. The air shifted with it, carrying a faint change in temperature, almost imperceptible but present. He reached a point where the passage opened into a small chamber, no larger than a walk-in closet, with walls that curved slightly inward like the inside of a sealed container. In the center of the floor sat a metal box, about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, its surface marked by the same faint lines he had seen along the passage. The pulse came again, and this time it was stronger, resonating through the box with a soft hum that filled the chamber. Daniel stepped closer, his flashlight beamed steady as he studied the object. There were no handles, no hinges visible from this angle, only a narrow seam running along the top edge. He crouched beside it, placing his hand gently against the surface. It was cold, but not lifeless. The vibration beneath his palm matched the rhythm he had been counting since the first night. 27 seconds. Exact. Scout's head appeared at the top of the passage behind him, his silhouette framed by the faint light from the cabin above. He did not come down. He simply watched, ears forward, body still. Daniel glanced back once, then returned his attention to the box. The patterns etched into the metal were clearer here, forming lines that intersected and curved in a way that suggested design rather than damage. He traced one with his finger, following its path until it led to the seam at the top. The next pulse came, and as it did, the line beneath his finger warmed slightly, just for a moment, then cooled again. Daniel drew a slow breath, the realization settling deeper with each second. This was not just something hidden. It was something that responded, and it had been waiting for someone to understand the rhythm before touching it at all. Daniel did not remove his hand from the surface of the box. He kept it there, steady and deliberate, as the faint warmth faded back into cold metal. The rhythm continued beneath his palm, precise and unchanging, each pulse arriving exactly when expected, as if the object itself was measuring him in return. He lowered the flashlight slightly, letting the beam rest along the etched lines, and began to follow them more carefully this time. They were not random markings. They curved and intersected with intention, forming a pattern that echoed something familiar, though he could not yet name it. Another pulse came, and the line beneath his fingers warmed again, just slightly, enough to confirm what he had sensed before. It was reacting, not to pressure, not to force, but to timing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air of the chamber. He pulled his hand back and waited. The next pulse passed without contact. Then another. He watched the surface closely, noting how nothing changed when he remained still. No light, no sound beyond the steady hum, just the quiet repetition of something waiting. He leaned forward again, this time placing his fingers on a different section of the pattern just before the next pulse arrived. He counted in his mind, steady and exact. When the moment came, the line beneath his touch responded again, a faint warmth spreading outward for less than a second before fading. He shifted slightly, testing another line, then another, each time aligning his touch with the rhythm. The response was consistent, subtle, but undeniable. Scout let out a soft breath from the passage above, the sound barely audible, but enough to draw Daniel's attention for a moment. The dog had not moved from his position, but his posture had changed. His head tilted slightly, ears adjusting as if he were listening to something deeper than the pulses themselves. Daniel returned his focus to the box. The pattern was not just decorative. It was a sequence, a path. He traced it with his eyes, mapping the connections, following where each line led, noticing how certain intersections aligned with others across the surface. It resembled a circuit, but not one designed for electricity. Something older, something quieter. He placed his hand back on the first line, then moved it slowly along the path, stopping at each intersection just before the next pulse. Each time, the warmth answered him, confirming he was following something real. The rhythm guided him, not hurried, not delayed, simply consistent. After several cycles, he reached the seam at the top of the box. The line he had followed ended there, fading into the narrow gap that separated the lid from the base. He paused, his hand hovering just above it. The next pulse came, stronger than before, and for a brief moment, the seam itself seemed to shift, not opening, but acknowledging the contact. Daniel's breath slowed as the realization settled deeper. This was not a lock in the traditional sense. It did not require force or a key. It required understanding, timing, patience. He adjusted his position, crouching lower, bringing both hands closer to the surface. If it was a sequence, Then there was more to it than a single path. He scanned the remaining lines, searching for another starting point, another route that connected back to the seam. The pattern revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, as if it only made sense when approached without urgency. Scout's silhouette remained at the top of the passage, still and watchful, a quiet presence that grounded the moment. Daniel placed his fingers on a second line, different from the first, and waited. When the pulse arrived, the warmth returned, slightly stronger this time, spreading further along the path before fading. He followed it, step by step, pulse by pulse, until it too led to the seam. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, not oppressive, but charged with something he could not fully describe. Two paths, both ending at the same place. Daniel drew a slow breath and looked at the surface one more time. There was one line left, thinner than the others, running diagonally across the top. He placed his hand on it and waited. When the pulse came, the response was immediate, the warmth sharper, lingering just a fraction longer. He followed it carefully, aligning each movement with the rhythm, until his fingers reached the seam once more. This time, when the next pulse arrived, the seam did not remain still. It shifted, just enough to be seen. A faint separation, no more than the width of a coin, appearing along the edge before settling again. Daniel did not move. He simply watched, his hand still resting against the metal, understanding now that whatever lay inside was not meant to be taken quickly. It was meant to be opened in the same way it had been waiting. Slowly. Exactly. And only when the rhythm was respected. Daniel kept both hands resting lightly against the surface of the box as the seam settled back into place, the faint gap closing as if it had never been there at all. He did not rush to try again. Instead, he sat back slightly, lowering his hands to his knees, letting the rhythm continue without interruption. The pulses moved through the chamber with the same quiet precision, each one arriving exactly when expected, as if nothing had changed. But something had. The box had responded. Not fully, not yet, but enough to confirm that the sequence mattered, and that he had only reached the beginning of it. He lifted his gaze, scanning the chamber again with slower, more deliberate attention. The curved walls reflected the flashlight in muted tones, revealing more of the faint etchings that lined the space. They were not limited to the box. The same patterns, extended outward, thinner and more worn, tracing along the metal surfaces like a continuation of the same design. Daniel stood carefully, his boots shifting slightly on the cool floor, and turned to examine the walls more closely. He raised the flashlight, following one of the lines as it curved upward and then disappeared near the ceiling. The next pulse came, and for a brief moment, the line shimmered, not with light, but with a subtle change in texture, as if the metal itself reacted in the same way the box had. He stepped closer, placing his fingers against the wall just before the next pulse. When it arrived, the response was immediate. A faint warmth, spreading outward along the line, then fading again. Daniel exhaled slowly, the realization deepening. The pattern was not confined to the box. It extended through the entire chamber. This was not a single mechanism. It was a system. Scout shifted above, his silhouette moving slightly as he adjusted his stance at the top of the passage. He let out a quiet, low sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something softer, almost like a reminder. Daniel glanced back toward him, then returned his focus to the wall. If the box required multiple paths, then the chamber itself might hold the rest of the sequence. He began to trace the lines along the wall, moving his hand in time with the pulses, testing each section with the same careful patience. Some responded. Others remained still. The ones that reacted seemed to connect, forming a larger path that circled the chamber before returning toward the box. He followed it slowly, step by step, counting each interval, aligning his movement with the rhythm that had guided him from the beginning. The air in the chamber felt different now, not heavier, but more aware, as if the space itself was responding to his understanding. After several cycles, he found himself back at the box, his hand resting once more near the seam. He paused, letting one full sequence pass without touching anything, then began again, this time following the combined path, from wall to box, from one line to the next, each movement timed precisely with the pulses. The responses grew slightly stronger with each correct alignment, the warmth lingering just a fraction longer, the faint hum deepening in tone. It was subtle, but it was building. When he reached the seam again, he did not stop. He placed both hands along the edge, fingers aligned with the intersecting lines, and waited. The next pulse came. This time, the reaction was different. The seam shifted more noticeably, the gap widening just enough to release a thin line of dim, steady light from within. It was not bright, not harsh, but soft, almost calm, like something that had been sealed away not to be hidden, but to be protected. Daniel held his position, not forcing the opening, simply maintaining the alignment as the next pulse arrived. The gap widened again, slowly, steadily, as if the box itself was deciding when it was ready to open. Scout remained still above, no longer watching the room, but the opening itself, his ears forward, his body quiet. Daniel felt the air change again, a faint warmth rising from within the box now, replacing the cold that had filled the chamber before. It carried no scent, no sound, only a presence that felt strangely familiar, like a memory just out of reach. The seam opened another fraction, enough now to reveal a narrow glimpse of what lay inside, though the light was too soft to show clear detail. Daniel did not lean closer. He did not rush. He simply stayed where he was, hands steady, breath even, allowing the process to continue as it had been meant to. Because for the first time since he had stepped into the chamber, he understood that this was not something he was uncovering. It was something that was allowing itself to be revealed, one pulse at a time. Daniel did not break the alignment even as the seam widened further, the soft light inside the box growing just enough to illuminate the edges of what lay beneath the lid. The pulses continued, steady and exact, but now they carried a different quality, less distant, more present, as if whatever was inside had shifted closer to the surface. He adjusted his hands slightly, following the lines instinctively now, no longer tracing them with uncertainty, but moving with the rhythm as if it had always been familiar. The chamber responded with him, the faint warmth spreading along the walls each time the sequence aligned, the entire space feeling less like a hidden room and more like something awake. Scout remained at the top of the passage, but his posture had changed again. He was no longer simply watching. He lowered himself slowly, resting his front paws on the edge of the opening, his head angled downward, eyes fixed on the light below. He did not descend, but he did not look away either. The next pulse came, and the seam opened wider, enough now for the lid to shift slightly on its own. It did not lift fully. It eased upward just a fraction, as if guided by something more precise than force. Daniel felt the change in the air immediately. The cold that had filled the chamber since he entered began to soften, replaced by a gentle warmth that carried no heat, only presence. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and leaned forward just enough to see inside. What he found was not machinery, not a vault, not anything that matched the structure around it. Inside the box lay a single object, resting at the center on a smooth surface that reflected the soft light upward. It was small, no more than the size of a paperback book, wrapped in a material that looked like aged cloth, though it held its shape too precisely to be fabric alone. The edges were worn, but not damaged, as if time had passed around it without ever fully touching it. The pulses continued, and with each one, the light inside the box grew slightly clearer, revealing faint markings along the surface of the object. Not letters, not numbers, but patterns similar to those on the walls, though more refined, more deliberate. Daniel did not reach for it. He remained still, his hands still aligned along the seam, allowing the process to continue as it had been from the beginning. The lid rose another fraction, enough now to expose the object fully. The light steadied, no longer shifting with each pulse, but holding a constant, quiet glow. The chamber fell into a different kind of silence, not empty, not waiting, but complete. Scout exhaled softly from above, the sound carrying down the passage like a quiet acknowledgement. Daniel shifted his gaze from the object to the surrounding chamber, noticing for the first time that the lines along the walls had stopped responding. The warmth had faded. The pulses, though still present, felt distant again, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. He slowly removed one hand from the seam, testing the stillness. Nothing changed. The lid remained open, the light steady. He removed the other hand, sitting back slightly, his attention returning to the object within the box. It did not move. It did not react. It simply rested there, as if it had been waiting for this moment, and nothing more. Daniel reached forward carefully, his movements measured, not from hesitation, but from respect for what he did not yet understand. His fingers hovered just above the surface, close enough to feel the faint warmth rising from it. For a brief moment, he paused, listening, not with his ears, but with the same quiet awareness that had guided him since the first night. The cabin above remained silent. The wind outside had stilled. Even the steady ticking of his watch seemed distant. Then, slowly, he touched it. The contact was immediate, but not sharp, not sudden. It felt like recognition, like placing his hand against something that already knew he was there. The warmth deepened slightly, spreading through his fingertips, not as heat, but as something steadier, something grounding. Daniel drew a quiet breath, his eyes fixed on the object, understanding now that whatever this was, it had not been hidden to be found by anyone. It had been waiting for someone who would listen long enough to follow the pattern all the way to its end. And now that he had, the silence that followed did not feel like an absence. It felt like an answer. Daniel did not pull his hand away immediately. He kept it resting on the surface of the object, letting the quiet warmth settle deeper, not into his skin, but somewhere beneath it, somewhere steadier than thought. The chamber remained still around him. The earlier pulses now faded into something softer, like an echo that had already served its purpose. The light within the box no longer shifted or responded. It simply held, its place, calm and unwavering, as if the act of being found had completed something long unfinished. He slowly lifted his hand, just enough to break contact, and watched as the warmth did not vanish but lingered faintly, like a memory that refused to leave all at once. The object remained unchanged, yet something about it felt different now, less distant, more present. Daniel reached again, this time more deliberately, and carefully slid his fingers beneath the edge of the wrapped surface. It did not resist. It did not react. It allowed itself to be lifted with a quiet ease that felt intentional. He raised it slowly from the box, holding it with both hands, the weight lighter than he expected, yet steady, balanced in a way that suggested it had been made to be held. As it cleared the edge of the box, the light within dimmed slightly, not disappearing, but settling, as if its purpose had shifted from illumination to something quieter. Daniel turned the object gently, studying the markings along its surface. The patterns were clearer now, refined lines that curved and connected with a precision that mirrored the chamber, yet felt more complete, more resolved. They were not instructions. They were not warnings. They were something closer to a record, a memory held in form rather than words. He traced one of the lines with his thumb, and for a brief moment, the warmth returned, faint but unmistakable, spreading outward in a soft, steady pulse that did not follow the old rhythm. It followed his touch. Scout shifted above, his movement drawing Daniel's attention upward. The dog had lowered himself further, his front paws now resting on the metal edge of the passage, his body leaning forward slightly, as if he could feel the change from where he stood. His ears were relaxed now, no longer searching, no longer listening for something hidden. Instead, he watched Daniel with a quiet calm that had not been there before. Daniel looked back down at the object, then toward the chamber walls. The etched lines that had once responded to each pulse now lay still, their surfaces unchanged, their presence quiet. The system that had guided him here had completed its work. Whatever it had been designed to do, it had done it. He stepped back slightly from the box, still holding the object, giving himself space to see the chamber as a whole. It no longer felt like something waiting to be opened. It felt like something that had already given what it needed to give. The air had shifted again, the earlier cold replaced by a neutral stillness that carried no urgency, no weight. Just quiet. Daniel turned the object once more, and as he did, he noticed something he had not seen before. Along one edge, where the patterns converged, there was a small indentation, subtle enough to be missed without close attention. Not a latch, not a keyhole, just a place where the lines ended together. He paused, considering it, then placed his thumb gently against the spot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the surface responded. Not by opening, not by shifting, but by revealing. The markings along the object deepened slightly, their lines becoming clearer, more defined, as if they were being brought into focus rather than changed. Daniel felt the warmth return once more, stronger now, spreading through the object and into his hands, not overwhelming, not sudden, but steady, grounding. And in that moment, without sound, without movement, he understood something that had been just out of reach since the first night. This had never been about finding something hidden. It had been about being ready to receive something that had been waiting all along. Scout lowered his head slightly, resting it against the edge of the opening, his eyes soft, his body finally at ease. Daniel stood there in the quiet chamber, the object held gently in his hands, the patterns now clear beneath his touch, and for the first time since he arrived at the cabin, the silence did not feel like something to be endured. It felt like something that had been listening, waiting for him to finally hear it back. Daniel did not rush to leave the chamber. He stood there for a long moment, the object resting steadily in his hands, its warmth no longer shifting or pulsing, but settled into something constant, something quiet. The light from the open box had dimmed further, now little more than a soft glow that barely touched the edges of the metal around it. The chamber itself felt different, no longer holding on to sound or breath, no longer waiting. It simply existed, complete in a way it had not been before. He turned slowly toward the passage, the narrow path leading back up to the cabin, and for the first time since he had stepped down, the space behind him did not call for his attention. It did not ask him to stay. It did not ask him to understand more. It had already given everything it was meant to give. Scout lifted his head as Daniel approached, stepping back just enough to make room, his eyes following the object rather than the man. There was no tension in him now, no alertness searching for something unseen. His tail moved once, low and calm, a simple acknowledgement that whatever had been out of place had found its end. Daniel climbed carefully, one hand holding the edge of the passage, the other keeping the object steady against his chest. The air grew warmer as he ascended, the familiar scent of wood and pine returning, grounding him in the world above. When he stepped back onto the cabin floor, the stillness felt different. It was no longer heavy. It no longer pressed against the walls. It rested there, light and open, like a space that had finally been allowed to breathe. He turned and looked back at the opening for a moment. The hatch remained open, the darkness below quiet and undisturbed. There was no pulse now, no vibration rising from beneath the floor. Only silence. Scout walked to the edge of the opening and looked down briefly, then turned away, as if there was nothing left to watch. Daniel moved to the table and set the object down carefully, the lantern light catching the patterns along its surface. They were clearer now, not brighter, but more present, as if they no longer needed to hide within the material itself. He pulled out the chair and sat, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been since he arrived. The ticking of his watch returned to the foreground, steady and familiar, no longer drowned out by something deeper. He looked at the object for a long time, not searching for answers, not trying to interpret the markings, but simply observing it as it was. Whatever it held, whatever it meant, it was not something that demanded to be solved. It had already fulfilled its purpose the moment he had followed the pattern all the way through. Scout settled beside him, lowering himself onto the wooden floor with a soft exhale, his head resting near Daniel's boot. His eyes closed slowly, not in exhaustion, but in a kind of quiet certainty. The nights ahead would be different. There would be no howling at 2:17 in the morning, no restless pacing, no signals to follow. The pattern had ended, and in its place, something else remained. Not a mystery, not a question, but a stillness that no longer felt empty. Daniel reached out and rested his hand lightly on the surface of the object one more time. The warmth was still there, faint but steady, like the echo of something that did not need to repeat itself to be remembered. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying a softer sound than before, less like a warning, more like a presence that had always been there, waiting to be heard without fear. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair, his gaze steady, his breathing even, the weight he had carried for so long no longer pressing in the same way. He had not been looking for anything when he came here. No answers, no meaning, just silence. But what he found was not silence at all. It was something that had been speaking the entire time, in a language that required patience, attention, and the willingness to stay when it would have been easier to leave. And now that it had been heard, the quiet that remained was not an absence. It was a kind of peace that did not need to announce itself to be real. Perhaps some things are not meant to be explained, only understood by the ones who choose to listen long enough to feel the pattern beneath the noise.